Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. The United States has recently vetoed a Canadian proposal to establish a G7 task force aimed at addressing Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers, which are used to circumvent Western sanctions. This decision has raised concerns among European nations about the potential implications for regional security and environmental safety. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss these developments and their potential impact on Europe is Tom Keatinge, Director of Center for Finance and Security at the Royal United Service Institute. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So can you first help us understand what are the primary reasons behind the U.S.'s decision to veto the creation of a G7 task force to address the shadow fleet?
Well, who knows what goes through Donald Trump's mind, but I think what we can notice is that on the third anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February, the EU and the UK brought forward new sanctions on Russian vessels and Russian infrastructure that is transporting, or the shadow fleet that is transporting Russian oil. The United States did not act. So we already had forewarning of the fact that the United States is losing its commitment to disrupting Russia's ability to sell its oil around the world for the last 2 or 3 weeks. So this announcement, in a way, is no surprise.
All right, Donald Trump mentioned putting more sanctions on Russia if it does not honor the ceasefire or if they don't come to the negotiation table. Could this possibly be a move to, well, still hold some cards to be played at the said negotiation table?
Well, possibly. I mean, obviously, Donald Trump is getting frustrated. He promised that he would end the war in Ukraine his first day. He then kind of extended that promise. And you can see that his desire to do a deal to bring a ceasefire to Ukraine is driving him to say all sorts of things. Perhaps he thought that Vladimir Putin would come to the negotiation table easily. As you point out, he said then towards the end of last week that with Russia pounding Ukraine, he might have to bring forward heavy sanctions on banks and others. So I think he's floundering around to some extent to figure out how to get the various parties to the table to discuss the peace that he and indeed, of course, everyone in Ukraine, in Poland and elsewhere around the world wants to see as soon as possible.
All right, so realistically, what does this veto mean? Will the G7 no longer be able to carry out said task force? And how is that going to impact the unity of the G7?
Well, obviously, the unity of the G7 is already strained, but we don't need, frankly, in Europe, the United States, in order to press forward with imposing economic restrictions on Russia. I mean, let's just think about it. The oil that we're talking about is carried on tankers that pass through the Baltic Sea, that pass through the Danish Straits, that pass through the English Channel, that pass through the Straits of Gibraltar. These are all waters controlled by Europeans. So we don't necessarily need the Americans to be part of this. And of course, it would be great if they would be. But in reality, this is something that we as Europeans need to address. And whether the United States is willing to come alongside the European Union and the UK and the other members of the G7, such as Canada or not, I don't think that should distract us from the mission, which is we need to restrict the funding and resourcing of the Russian military in order to restrict its ability to wage its war in Ukraine.
All right. What specific risks does this operation of the shadow fleet pose to European maritime security and environmental safety? Or do you think it's mostly about straining Russians' war coffer?
No, it's very much a risk to environmental safety. So, a key element of the shadow fleet is that it is not properly insured. It's certainly not insured by insurance companies that would traditionally insure vessels that are floating around the world carrying oil. Secondly, these vessels are very old. They are past their sell-by date. And so therefore, the risk of them breaking up and creating an oil spill is enormous. So the states that border the Baltic Sea, including Poland, of course, should be very concerned about this. And I think this goes to the heart of the challenge that Western countries face, is trying to find a legal means to perhaps arrest these vessels, to restrict them, because at the moment we are very nobly observing the clauses of the UN Charter on the Law of the Sea, which allows for innocent passage of vessels through our waters. But if they present an environmental threat, which they really do in this case because they're so old, then we should be taking steps. And I think that's frankly where European nations, particularly those around the Baltic Sea, should be more aggressive in challenging these vessels, because not only are they funding the Russian military, they also present environmental time bombs that risk washing up on the beautiful beaches of Poland and elsewhere.
All right, you just mentioned that, well, the shadow fleet mostly functions in European waters. And in fact, if the Europeans do want to put a stop to it, it should be on their collective efforts to do so. And also point out some of the challenges when it comes to actually finding a legal solution. Do you think most of the hurdle are now, well, on the said challenge that you just mentioned, or are there any other factors where it's impeding European leaders' political will to carry it out?
Well, you said the key phrase there. I think it's political will. One of the things that we've learned over the last 3 years, indeed we've learned over the last 2 decades in dealing with Vladimir Putin, is he thrives on the fact that we as European nations follow the rule of law. And while we follow the rule of law, he doesn't. So this is a classic example where European states are essentially saying, well, because of the UN Charter and various other laws of the sea, we can't touch these vessels. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin says, well, thank you very much. If you're not going to touch the vessels, I will carry on transporting my oil around the world to people who are willing to buy it, and thus funding my illegal war in Ukraine. So I think it does come down to political will. It comes down to recognizing that Vladimir Putin is running rings around the sort of the glacial pace at which decisions are unfortunately made amongst the G7 community. But we shouldn't be distracted by this headline from the United States. At the end of the day, these waters are controlled by us on this side of the Atlantic, and therefore we frankly don't need the Americans if we are going to proceed with restricting these shadow fleet vessels.
Right, here's an interesting one. Do you think that the current kind of sort of antagonistic relation between Donald Trump's administration and the EU would probably actually hasten the Europeans to take action, seeing that, well, the Americans essentially are saying that we don't want to get involved in this?
Look, I think one of the favorite phrases I heard once from a senior member of the European Commission was, Tom, you've got to understand the European Union manages from, quote, crisis to crisis. And, here we definitely face a crisis. I do think there's one thing worth bearing in mind, which, of course, the concept of shadow fleet is not new. Other sanctions evaders, such as Iran, have used this kind of mechanism for some time. On the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it was actually on Iranian shadow fleet that the Americans placed sanctions. So perhaps if Europe were to use some of the skills and the expertise it's learned about managing shadow fleet threats over the last 3 years and applied that to the Iran file, maybe that would be something that Donald Trump would recognize and perhaps come back to the table to talk about Russia. But who knows?
Right. Can you talk about the fleet a little bit more about how much this impacts the overall effectiveness of current sanctions when it comes to Russia's war coffer?
Well, of course, Russia views sanctions from the West as an existential threat. And so, of course, the Kremlin will do whatever is necessary to create the structures that it needs in order to evade those sanctions. And I think this is where a dichotomy exists, a contradiction exists, because Western countries approach the implementation of sanctions bit by bit, I said already, in a glacial fashion. The Russians see the sanctions and react immediately, negating to some extent the sanctions that have been put together in the various packages, 16 now, by the European Union. So I think if we're serious about restricting the financing and the resourcing of the Russian military, then we need to put ourselves in the same mindset as the Kremlin. And that means we need to recognize that we are essentially at economic war with Russia. I don't want to overstate this, but that is how Russia views the sanctions ranged against it. So if we want to disrupt the shadow fleet and therefore the ability of Russia to raise money through it selling its oil around the world, then we need to think more creatively and frankly more aggressively about how we use the sanctions. Sanction more vessels, sanction those who are facilitating the trade in Russian oil, and basically, if you like, drive the appetite for Russian oil away. And perhaps people then buy oil from the United States instead. And guess who would be very happy if that were to occur? Because, of course, that creates profit for the American people. And I'm, of course, referring to the new president of the United States.
Right. You mentioned earlier about maritime regulations and enforcement mechanisms. Do you think that there's any role for that to play when it comes to hindering these Russian shadow fleet vessels? Or do you see that actually as a more of a stumbling block when it comes to Europeans trying to apply its sanctions?
So I think to some extent it's a stumbling block. The IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is the sort of the global body that sets standards and leads this issue. And obviously, the ability to sail freely around the world has been a closely protected right for decades, indeed centuries. And so I think the result is, because these organizations are really quite inflexible in their willingness to change the way they operate, because they are globally operating organizations. They're responsible for the seas around the whole world, and there's a relevant UN charter that I've mentioned a few times. It's very inflexible. So the question really is, how can we be creative within the rules and regulations that exist? And I think that's why we in particular need to focus on the environmental risk to try and disrupt these vessels as much as possible. But as I say, we should also be trying to disrupt those that are buying the oil. If there isn't a market for the oil, then there's no need for a shadow fleet. The shadow fleet has no role to play.
Right, so perhaps not only target the supply side, but also the demand side of things, and hopefully it could be figured out.
Yeah, without question. I mean, I think the demand side is something that we've been nervous about targeting, but I get the sense that that's a direction that the Europeans, and maybe that's what we'll see coming out of the G7. We'll see more active commentary from certain G7 countries, more active commentary about targeting the demand side, as you rightly point out.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. For more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.